We're seeing labour market disruption. We're seeing food and water scarcity, price rises. So we have to think about using different kinds of instruments and designing them in different ways so they can meet these emerging challenges. And we have to avoid maladaptive responses. Are some of our responses actually leading to people becoming entrenched in non-sustainable, non-viable livelihoods and locations, which with climate change will no longer be feasible to support their livelihoods? Also, the change in the temporal pattern means that we really have to think hard about integrating humanitarian and social protection programming and financing, because the distinctions between these two areas of intervention are going to become increasingly blurred and messy. And finally, in terms of the spatial distribution effects that I mentioned, we have to think how programming can accommodate these changing geographic focuses. We need to anticipate where the needs are going to occur and then look at how we can deliver support in these particular areas. I think one other thing I wanted to share with you is the fact that there's a question about what social protection can do in this context. What is the function of social protection? And that's the other contextual piece of information I just wanted to share with you, because I think the community's been looking at this very hard over the last few years, and we've identified 5 main areas where social protection can actually respond to climate change. One is the familiar area of reducing underlying vulnerability to climate change, which I think is an area many of us are already involved in, and social protection clearly has a major role there. The second is responding to climate shocks and disasters, known to many people as shock responsive social protection. That's clear function. Another is offsetting the negative welfare impacts of climate transition policies. This is often overlooked. This is looking at how you address the welfare impacts, for example, of removing fuel subsidies or of closing particular industries, which will have an impact on the economy of certain areas. And so that's also an area where your social protection policy needs to be linked to your industrial and climate policies. The fourth is facilitating and enabling climate change adaptation outcomes. Again, I think this is an area we'll be discussing in the ensuing presentations. And the final one is that social protection can be used to actually contribute to reduced greenhouse gas emissions, contribute to carbon sequestration, ecosystems restoration. So it is possible to actually use social protection, design it in such a way that you can actually address these, mitigate these direct climate challenges. So my last slide is, well, what does this all mean for us as a community? And I think we really need to rethink some of the social protection orthodoxies that we've been working with for the last 3 or 4 decades. In terms of rights, we need to think carefully about the rights of the climate displaced, climate migrants, climate refugees. This is an issue which has started to come up within the UN, and I think we really need to look at how that can be supported and move forward. We need to look at the institutional architecture. Is it adequate? Do we have the right institutions? Do they have the right mandate? And we also need to look at this at a regional and national level. We need to look at policy alignment, both making sure that our humanitarian and social protection interventions are informed by climate change analysis, but also enabling social protection to contribute to national climate policies. So there's space for alignment there. And of course, the other area which really does need to move forward is this ongoing discussion about integrating humanitarian and social protection policies. In terms of program design, we need to really think about moving away from a project-based, highly targeted set of instruments to those which can respond to these new challenges, new populations, new areas, large-scale covariate risks. So we need to think about how we can make that change in the way we design programs. Operational systems is the other key area. It's coming up so often now. It was clear during COVID, and it's clear that to respond to climate, we need to have strong basic ID registration payment systems. And the key thing here is that they need to be interoperable, and they need to enable trans-border provision, because in the future, we're going to be seeing a great deal more movement of populations, including transboundary challenges. So we need to really be looking at how operational systems can be activated and functional across borders. And finally, in the financing area, we need to look more at burden sharing approaches. We need to rethink both domestic provision of social protection and provision for those who've crossed boundaries, because we're going to see increasing limits to domestic fiscal space as the cost of climate change becomes greater. in many countries with these experiencing these effects. But also we're already seeing constraints in humanitarian funding, and ODA is likely to be constrained once climate costs start to be borne by donor governments. So in fact, we have to think how we can look at burden sharing and how we can rationalize the use of resources. So I hope that's provided a context, it's provided some challenges. Thank you very much. I look forward to discussing these issues more, and I know my colleagues will be taking forward their thinking on this in the following slides. So thank you very much.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Anna. That was such a nice, critical yet succinct overview of this debate. I think you've raised many challenging areas for us to revisit, to reflect on when we come back to the discussion at the end. We won't take questions between the talks, but do add your questions in the chat, and we will come back to that later. But now I would like to hand over to our colleague from the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, Megan Bailey, who will be introducing a game that sounds super exciting. So don't be put off, don't disappear from the Zoom chat. I think it will be a really fun exercise. So Megan, take it away.
Thanks, Jeremy. You can look in the chat. I believe my colleague Marta, yes, thank you, has sent us a link. So I'll give everyone a moment to click on the link. It'll work on the laptop or on the phone. If you are having trouble on your laptop, depending on which browser you're using, you might want to try on your phone as a backup. That seems to work well when other technology fails. If you click on the link, you should see a blue screen that is on the Good Games platform. I will share my screen if I can. Go, and you'll be able to see what I see. You should see what I see. Cool. All right. So we've heard a little bit about the use of social protection systems to manage different risks. In the basic project, we've been looking at the way that social protection systems can be used to manage the compounding risks associated with climate change and conflict. So this is your chance to have a rant. It's anonymous. Of course, we always have to be, appropriate and measured, but these are anonymous rants that I'm going to get you to make. They should be sort of tweet-like, so they're short. You will have, when we move to the next screen and Marta starts the timer, you will have just 180 seconds to write as many short rants. So what do you find challenging? What is bothering you? What are your pet peeves, bugbears associated with thinking about social protection systems to manage risks associated with climate and conflict? What are the challenges? What are people missing? What should we be paying more attention to? This is your chance to write a quick rant. Afterwards, we'll have an opportunity to revisit those rants and to adjust them and see if we can turn those into actions that we can address within our sector. But for now, just focus on the negative. Focus on the kinds of things that you just want to get off of your chest. It's a very short section before we move into some more presentations. So, Marta, please feel free to move us to the next screen. All right. So here, you'll see me, I'm going to try one. We just need to give people more money. That's just my quick example rant. Okay, there's one rant. Everyone, please feel free to write as many as you can in the remaining 158 seconds. Go for it. Yes, they're coming in. The technology is working. We need to listen more to local communities. Too much talk with buzzwords. We need to collaborate. Some references to territoriality, definitely. Keep them coming. This is prolific. Siloing between development and humanitarian, with climate actions coded as, quote, development. We need more funding mechanisms, better funding mechanisms. We're focusing too much on adaptation. We have a sector that may not be understanding what climate change really is. Keep them going. Big organizations have an incentive not to work across sectors. Why are they wasting our time? There's not enough done to facilitate partnerships. We've got 1 minute left. Get the last thing off your chest. There must be well more than 100 there now. It's amazing. Social protection frameworks and disaster frameworks do not match priorities. Keep going. Everyone try to get in one more last one in the remaining 30 seconds. We're not communicating with the beneficiaries to identify needs and their wants and their norms. "15 seconds left. Finish your last thought. Send it in. 3, 2, 1. Perfect. Don't X out of the screen. We will revisit this after we've had some presentations, and I'm hoping that we're going to get some ideas from these presentations of how we might want to adjust some of these rants, turn them into priorities, actions, ways of thinking about things that will help us make some progress. All right, I'm going to hand over back to Jeremy. Again, keep this screen and we'll revisit it in a few minutes.
Yes, thank you, Megan. That was oddly therapeutic. At least for me, it felt so good to dump anonymously. So thank you for that. We will be coming back to the positive part of that exercise later in the session. So we are moving on now to another colleague from the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. Christopher Jack will be speaking about climate storylines, a new methodology that the Climate Center has been using, and it shows a lot of potential in this space. So, Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, and thanks so much, Anna, for the introduction and for the rants, which were really, really interesting. I see I've got these things coming up. Let me just try and turn captions off. Yeah, I think that's off. That was from yesterday. Yeah, thanks for the overview, Anna. The rants are impressive and quite daunting, so I hope we're going to get back to addressing some of those. So I'm going to take quite a different angle here. I'm a climate scientist. I'm actually based at the University of Cape Town, but also work at the Red Crescent Climate Center. So my background is in climate science, and in particular in trying to bring climate science into decision making. So this is a somewhat new space for me, and for some of my colleagues as well. But it's been really interesting trying to understand the social protection, social assistance space, and how we do start bringing climate science into it. I really love this infinite loop diagram, and you've probably seen it quite a few times, but in many ways, this for me captures what we're talking about, this kind of infinite loop of crises and recovery and more crises. So I hope that's helpful. Okay, so Anna already covered some of this, but I just wanted to sort of re-emphasize particularly the messages coming out of the IPCC, some of the really strong messages around the existing impacts or the past impacts that we've observed from climate change, particularly on vulnerable communities in many of the countries in which we're working. Roughly half of the world's population currently experiencing severe water scarcity for some part of the year. And then very high confident messages about climate impacts and risks exacerbate vulnerability and social and economic inequalities. And then a key one I think we're talking a lot about today is undermining efforts to achieve sustainable development, undermining other efforts to reduce poverty and so on. So I think we're all very clear on some of the risks, some of the challenges that we're facing. When we start bringing climate science in, and I had to put a climate sciencey map on there, it really becomes quite challenging because there's so many uncertainties. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but one of the key uncertainties that often gets raised is how is the local climate changing? Often we don't have good observational data. We don't have long climate records in many of these countries. We don't actually know how the climate has been changing in the past. It's also compounded because often what people are experiencing as change is compounded by other factors like deforestation and degradation that so often comes up in conversations we have with communities and with other stakeholders. So what is the climate change signal and what is coming from other factors? And then really getting down to the guts of it, if you like, is how does climate and the related phenomena really impact households and communities in these fragile contexts? We know, and there are existing and traditional resilience strategies. Many communities have been living in these areas for hundreds of years. They're used to droughts and floods and cycles of those. So we understand that there are existing resilience strategies. In many cases, the impacts may be delayed and compounding. So it's actually quite difficult to begin to understand how these interactions actually happen. And of course, again, we have limited data about what is happening, what is shifting, what is changing. And Lars later will present some really rich data on some of this. And then the key question we're asking is how will climate change into the future? Sometimes the changes in rainfall are very uncertain. So the map on the left there is from the IPCC Atlas, and projected changes in rainfall. Don't need to go into the details, but wherever there's like hashing or diagonal lines, that means there's a lot of uncertainty around how rainfall will change. We know that temperatures are going to increase. We know that some extremes are going to increase. But how will these actually impact households and communities into the future? And so we end up in what we call this this kind of pyramid of cascading uncertainty. And again, I don't have time to go through a lot of details, but even starting from the simple question of how will emissions goals be reached or not reached? Will we manage to stay below 2 degrees warming? And then cascading through what are the implications of that at the local level, regional level, impacts on water systems and agriculture, impacts on food security. And we end up with this very large uncertainty at the end. And often this is extremely challenging when we start bringing it into decision making. We also have these sort of classic framings of risk. So the framing on the left there from previous IPCC assessment reports, very classic of intersection of hazards, vulnerability, and exposure producing risk. In the last IPCC report, and particularly in the Africa chapter, some of the authors contributed a new petal, if you like, to this leaf, which is the response, because we know that people are not passive, and communities are not passive, and systems are not passive. So we have to include their responses. Sometimes those responses are positive, and sometimes those are negative. So it becomes a much more complex picture of risk. And again, I'm not going to go into the details here, but the fundamental message I'm trying to bring across is this climate risk is complex, and we're increasingly appreciating the complexity of risk. So how do we think about it? How do we think about future climate risk? How do we bring it into these already complex places like social protection? And so that's where we're bringing in the idea of storylines. Storylines emerged from the physical climate science community, and it's really a response to this cascading uncertainty and the attempt to produce probabilistic or deterministic projections of how things are going to change into the future. And it kind of flips things around and says, well, let's navigate through that uncertainty and plot these plausible pathways that say, well, what happens if rainfall changes in this way, extremes change in this way, and other factors change in different ways? What would be the outcome of that? And so in many ways, it's a heuristic tool for us to think through this complexity rather than predict what's going to happen. Let's think through what would be the implications of different futures. And then we can begin to design those responses to those different futures in a way that's robust. So we can think of an adaptive response of improved land management, and that might decrease the increased flooding that we've already generated in a storyline. So again, they're heuristic tools, they're ways of thinking through the implications of different unfoldings of events, and we're starting to see them being brought into lots of different decision-making spaces. So how do we do it? Very quickly now. I don't have a lot of time to go into the detail, but this is some work we've been doing in Niger, also under the IDS basic program. We're building evidence from looking at past events, so looking at past rainfall and past, in this case, food prices in an area in Niger, but also looking at the longer sequence, so seeing there's a sequence of early cessation of rainfall, locust swarm, migration of livestock southwards in response, high cereal prices, flooding. There's a sequence of things that occurred, an unfolding of events, if you like, that resulted in the 2005 food price crisis in Niger. So digging into what was happening there, all the dynamics, how things interacted, begins to tell a bit of a story and allows us to build a bit of understanding about how things are actually functioning. Just looking at locust swarms, for example, we can begin to map where they are. And then diving into the climate science, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I wanted to highlight one thing that has come up in our interactions. We often talk about droughts and floods, and often we're talking about droughts. But sometimes you can have a very normal year. I'm just going to highlight one here. So 2023 was actually a relatively normal year in Plaster and the Mara region in Ethiopia. But if you look in the sections on the right there, I don't know if you can see my pointer, the year started off fairly well, but then extremely dry second half, the long rains in that region of the country. And that has significant impacts. And until we dive into these kind of levels of detail, we don't really understand how climate is impacting. And we make bad assumptions. So finally, we can build these kind of cognitive maps, and I'm very happy to talk about the approach here, and I know there are some critics of these kind of approaches, but trying to bring together the different evidence, how we're thinking about the way elements interact with each other. Some of these links are confident, some are very uncertain, and we have to acknowledge there's a lot of uncertainty in many of these, and we have to make some assumptions. But again, this is where the storyline approach begins to be useful. So we can begin to map through and we say, well, let's look at a future where rainfall changes in a certain way. What would be the implications in this context? But also, what would be the implications if other things shifted, if migration increased, or if conflict increased in a particular region? And again, it's not predicting what's going to happen, it just helps us think through how are things interacting. And then hopefully that allows us to develop things like social assistance programs that are not limited to a single simplified climate narrative. So I think if I want to end with anything, it's that last point. Let's not rest on simplified climate narratives that say drought, food security problems. There's a much more complex, nuanced interaction, cascading and compounding over time, contributing to vulnerability. And we need to be designing programs and adaptation responses in that context. Sorry, I speak very fast, so I hope I haven't blurred things, but thank you. I'm going to leave it there.
Not at all. Thank you, Chris. That was very clear, very interesting. I'm sure there will be some questions around this method, which was a whirlwind tour to the climate storyline approach. But I think, making good connections as well with some of the points Anna raised before around uncertainty and the need to really open up our thinking to what some very different futures could look like. So we will again come back to some of this in the discussion. If you haven't put any questions in the chat, please do so. If there's anything on your mind, to channel my high school biology teacher, there's no such thing as a dumb question. So please feel free to ask anything, and I'm sure our panelists would be happy to engage with that later. Right, so now we are going to turn to some new research findings from Northern Ethiopia. I'll be handing over to my colleague Lars Otto, who I have been working with, as well as our colleague Rachel Sabates-Wheeler and Yehanbale Teshome from Ethiopia. They are both online as well. So Lars will be introducing you to some new findings from our work in a conflict-affected setting. So over to you, Lars.
Thanks very much, Jeremy, and hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and it was fascinating to see the rants earlier. Thanks, Megan, and team for facilitating that. So yes, as Jeremy said, I'm going to give an overview of some emerging research findings from an ongoing study under the Basic Research Project program in Ethiopia, and particularly on the linkages between social assistance in the form there of the Productive Safety Net program, PSNP, and particularly focus on our sites in Amhara. So just a couple of things to say at the outset. First, as Jeremy alluded to, I'm presenting on behalf of a team of researchers from IDS, as well as Ethiopia, Yihan Belay Tshome, and colleagues who I believe are online as well. And the second thing to say is that it's very difficult to do justice to our findings in a few minutes. So this is by necessity, in a way, a quite high level and selective overview. So we can come back to more details in the discussions later. So as a framing, then our focus and motivation, so to speak, is what Anna talked about earlier, the increasing promise and indeed expectation around the role of social protection, social assistance, to help and support adaptation and to strengthen climate resilience. There's been quite a lot of work on this over the last 10-15 years, including adaptive social protection and other programs and concepts. And to look at in more detail how and whether and how social protection and social assistance may support resilience capacities. And that includes, for example, the ability to plan, the ability to absorb shocks and stresses, and also to cope with stresses and to adapt and even transform livelihoods in that context. Much and indeed most of this work has been done in politically stable context. So we know an increasing amount of how the role of social protection and how that can support and play a role in those contexts. We know a lot less about this in conflict-affected settings. So this is where our work comes in particular. And these are contexts where, of course, government authority around social protection is either patchy or missing or contested or all of the above. So our project then, and the study in Ethiopia is looking at these three questions. So that includes the past, in this case, how the PSNP has supported since its inception nearly 20 years ago in the region. To what extent, secondly, then, in terms of whether and how it's mitigated impacts of conflicts and climate-related shocks, whether and how, then secondly, it addresses vulnerability drivers and can help adaptation going forward. And then from there, what role it might play in the future. So geographically then, just to highlight that, the study is taking place, the broader study, which includes a mixed methods study of including quantitative and qualitative methods and assessment of including also the climate data, is taking place in the shaded area here on the map. And you can see an overview of the methods we've used in those areas. And what I'm going to talk about here mainly, is for Bugna and Lasta in Amhara region. And that's in the middle, going from north to south of the shaded area. So this is an area that's been severely affected by spillover of the conflict in neighboring Tigray, including an incursion of Tigrayan forces in 2021 and a brief incursion again in August, September 2022 before a peace agreement was signed in November 2022. But the conflict is still ongoing, and indeed there are other conflicts where this area has been affected by in Oromia, for example. And this is also an area which is no stranger to shocks, stressors over a long time. As you can see in this timeline that's generated from our data in Amhara. Different colors represent different types of shock stressors and developments. The developments, largely positive, are at the top half of that timeline, and the shocks and stresses are at the bottom half. I won't go through all of these, but just to note the prominence of climate-related events here in the darker green color. And this was in the heartland of the 1984 drought and famine. And this is an event and a period that's very vivid in people's memory, either by the people we talked to and interviewed, or their parents, and indeed in the community that where we did our study. Another major event, excuse me, is to point out is, of course, the Tigray conflict and how that affected the area starting in 2021, and which at the point of data collection for the qualitative work last year was still having a major impact in the people in the communities where we visited. So as you can also see, PSMP in the middle, about the middle of the graph, started in 2005, 2006, and has now operated for nearly 20 years, with a new phase starting in 2021, involving also retargeting just before the conflict started. So through our research, we were particularly interested in whether and how PSMP had made a difference in that period to deal with climate-related shocks and stresses amidst everything else that was going on. So what role has PSMP played? I'm going to show two quotes that reflects very well and kind of is at the core of how people perceive PSMP in this context. And the first one is around, as you can read, PSMP support makes us not to die, not to recover. And this is something that came up time and time again. And in variations, it was support that helped them not to die, but not to live, i.e. surviving, but not thriving. So it was at a very minimal level amidst severe livelihoods, shocks and stresses, particularly the conflict, which is very fresh in people's minds, obviously, in the area. And importantly, alongside this, a second quote is that it's illustrating that while it's not something that changes their lives and barely supports them to survive, it's still important as a kind of guarantee for support on credit, for example, and that helps them have some predictability, even if at times patchy and unreliable, it still provides that lifeline to people, which speaks to the importance of PSMP too. So I have very limited time, so I'm going to just synthesize in one slide what sort of the broader findings are against the research questions I put at the beginning. And I'm happy to speak more to those later on. So, so the first one around mitigating impacts. First thing to say is that the climate shock, even though the conflict had profound impact in this area, climate shocks were still ranked also in the quantitative surveys as a major concern. And this relates to what Chris talked about earlier, that there is which is kind of corroborating what we've found, what people were saying, that there is a strong sense that the climate is changing, even amidst uncertainties and the high climate variability. And this is manifest in more variable and more erratic rainfall, but long periods of droughts, but also an increase in intensity of the rainfall. So even if you look at the annual totals, the cumulative totals over a year, it's not actually that dramatic. But if you look at the intra-annual data that Chris showed earlier, you can see these variations and droughts followed by floods that are damaging crops, damaging houses, even affecting livestock, are devastating to already very precarious livelihoods. The second thing to say is that peer support has provided a protective function, and it's very clear that this is also in combination with humanitarian assistance that kind of played a complementary role in this context over the years, but also during then the last couple of years during and after the conflict. In terms of addressing the vulnerability drivers, and here we come to the sort of whether and how they are better able to deal with shocks if there was a similar shock in the future, that is less clear, and it's actually quite clear that PSMP support in the current amounts and the current form it's provided, it's inadequate to build adaptive or let alone more deeper transformative capacities for people to kind of move out of poverty or transform their livelihoods. It's simply too small. It's and the amounts that people are given are way too small to make that kind of difference. And I think that sort of puts a little bit of a reality check on some of the, at least some of the more optimistic ends of the discussions around the role of social protection for climate adaptation, building climate resilience. So I think that our finding speaks to that kind of caution that we need to be realistic in what we can expect from already overstretched programs like the PSMP. Having said that, and I think it's equally important to emphasize that PSMP does provide an important protective function, preventing or at least mitigating the sort of more erosive coping strategies that can be very damaging to livelihoods. So I think that role is perhaps undervalued and under-emphasized in many discussions as well. So it would be easy in a way to dismiss the role of social protection on the basis of PSMP being overstretched, being inadequate, and so on. But I think that's an important finding that's coming out, that it does actually play an important role nevertheless. So in terms of its future role, I think what we're suggesting is that actually PSMP would do well to kind of return in a way to, or re-emphasize the productive functions, which was the founding function of PSMP, and focus on the kind of the basic functions of PSMP in terms of market access, credit, which may not seem at first sort of directly linked to resilience, yet is crucially important for resilience to be strengthened, and also to nurture that kind of improvisation, learning, and adaptation by the practitioners who are there already. And related to that, I think also realize the limits of designing resilience from the outside, and put more focus on building resilience from the bottom up, and highlight the kind of important role for investment in these local capacities, and also recognize and strengthen the local knowledge. As Chris also said, there is a lot of traditional and indigenous and local knowledge in these areas. They may be inadequate, and they may clearly need additional support. But I think recognizing that is a good starting point. And this is a message that's obviously not new, but bears repeating, and is important to repeat. So I'll stop there. I'm probably used my time and more of that. So thank you, and happy to take further questions.
Great, thank you, Lars Otto. It's really helpful, I find, in this huge debate to look at particular places. So it's been really nice to hear about how these issues are unfolding in a specific context. But to sort of carry on a theme of reality checks, as Lars Otto mentioned, we need to come back to our rants and round 2 of the game. So Megan, can you take us through the next step?
Yes, thanks so much. I've shared my screen. If anyone has closed the window, please do revisit it. And perhaps might be good to share the link again, actually, Marta, in case for anybody who has joined us a bit later. You can join in the second round of it, even if you haven't done the first. Marta, can you move us to the next section? Nice. Okay. So we've got our rants here. I've been given a random selection of them, and you will as well. And I can choose which one I would like to then decide to adjust. And we'll have a few minutes. It won't be as much of a rush as it was last time. Okay. So I'm going to choose. All right. Fund the projects long term. So I've chosen one that I want to address. I'm going to, just giving you my credit card information. So in order to fund the projects long term, I'm going to say social protection systems need to position themselves to access climate finance, loss and damage. Okay, there's my suggestion of how we can change the rant, this negative, into something. What is an action we can take? How can we reframe it? It doesn't always have to be, flipping it to be something positive per se, but a reframing it or a different way of looking at it, some suggestion of at least a part of that that can be approved. So I am entering that in, and you'll see that it has kept the original rant and then added my suggestion. So we're going to put the timer on for 5 minutes, and you can do as many as you have time for. If you're looking through and you don't see anything that is speaking to you, you can press this more please, and it will give you another set. You can I suspect you'll be able to make maybe 6, 7, 8 adjustments. So choose the ones that you would like, and good luck. We'll see them coming in as they go. Please do put a message in the chat if you're struggling. Otherwise, enjoy the therapeutic 5 minutes. We've got 1 more minute. So please finish writing your thought. Great, thanks very much. Marta, are you able to move us to the next section? So that is the end of our 5 minutes to update the rants. Now you'll see that you'll be given a random selection of them, and we'll have a few minutes. We'll do another sort of 4 to 5 minutes to vote the adjustments up or down. So you'll see we've put in there's the original rant, and then we've also added in what the adjustment was by one of the participants. So you can decide to vote it up, vote it down, or skip. I'm going to set the clock again. We will have 5 minutes to do the voting, and we will then have a discussion on the ones that get voted up to the top. Probably about 3 to 5 of them we'll be able to discuss a bit more in detail before we move into the general discussion with the panelists. Thanks. I should say that at this stage, it is helpful to be very discerning. So the save your voting up for the ones that really resonate with you and not the ones that you just generally agree with. So you can skip the ones that you maybe generally agree with and don't really feel like passionate about. And this will help us really sort of have a few that rise above. I had to say that for myself because they're coming through and they're all very coherent and helpful. And I was like, oh no, but if we all just keep voting them all up, we won't, we'll have no prioritization. I'll stop talking. We've got 1 more minute to finish voting. Try and vote for maybe 2 or 3 more in the minute we have left. All right, my counting is correct. We are through our 5 minutes of voting. I will share my screen again. Marta, can you bring us again? All right, so we're making a little slideshow. Just give the Good Games platform a second to do its thing. And we'll see the ones that have been upvoted and have a tiny reflection on each one, and then I'll hand over to Jeremy. Marta, do we need to click through, or it's still thinking?
It's creating. You just have to wait.
An overload of ideas, I think, Megan.
Yeah, in the end, we can see some stats about how many votes there were, how many rants. I think it was a lot, actually. It's coming through hot and fast. Hope people found that to be a nice reflection process. Let's see what comes up as being the top rated.
I hope there's no vote rigging going on behind the scenes.
I've heard that's a big problem.
Depends on who you ask. It is taking its sweet time.
It is.
Yeah, it's taking some time to load.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know if we want to, while we're waiting for it to load, I'm sure it'll pop up any second while we might get in the middle of a question, but I know there was one question in the chat to Anna from another Anna, and Anna, you did respond to it. I don't know if you wanted to say anything more to that. It was a very good question around additionality being a real challenge for how social protection actors seek climate finance and how to overcome barriers around that. It was directed to Anna, but I think others on the panel might also have thoughts around that issue of additionality. Anna, did you want to say anything more, additionally to your response to that, or other panelists, would they like to come in? As I thought. Yeah.
Hi, yes.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Yeah, so my question is related to my experience discussing with climate financing experts. Well, I work in the West Africa region and specifically in the Sahel. And of course, social protection practitioners see a lot of opportunity here to mobilize climate resources to expand coverage of social protection, because coverage gaps are really huge in the region. And we always get the same argument, which is sort of stops the conversation, where the climate experts explain to us that in order to mobilize climate funds for social protection, we need to clearly show the additionality of these funds versus development funds. They cannot fund the same things. But for social protection, because of all the things that we've said, in a way, it's very difficult to untangle, because social protection, well, social cash transfers, for instance, they have impacts on a lot of aspects. And of course, you can top them up with complementary measures and access to services and other programs. But in a way, you need the foundation to be there in order to start complexifying. So, I mean, Anna already provided some elements in terms of arguments, but at the same time, I feel like it's a little bit of a bottleneck that we have still. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, Anna McCord, did you want to pick up on that? And then anyone else from the panel, feel free to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing was said by Lars Otto. He said that the recipient said, you know, we didn't die. It's not transforming our lives, but we had enough to eat. And I think the fundamental argument we have to keep making is that social protection can enable people to survive these kind of climate impacts. And so investment in basic systems, in extending basic provision, is an absolutely key response. And it's kind of a response when adaptation and other responses fail, in a sense. You know, it's the ultimate support. And so I think we really have to make that argument. If we claim too much, then we can be criticized. Lars Otto was saying, you know, if we claim that it'll be transformatory and then it isn't transformatory, if it doesn't really enable people to adapt significantly, that doesn't mean it's a failure. If it keeps people alive, it's a success. So I think we have to really reinforce the case that social protection is a mechanism for enabling people to survive and using that as the basis of the discussion. But then it can also have these other functions. You know, there were the five different functions. But I think we have to really reiterate that even this basic achievement of social protection is valid and important. And maybe we can't use climate funds for everything at the moment. You know, maybe we have to use climate funds for certain components of programs rather than extending basic provision and basic operational systems. But I think that is definitely a discussion that we need to develop, Anna. You're quite right. But over to my colleagues.
Yes, Lars Otto, Chris, Megan, did any of you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think Anna covered much of it, but I could just add maybe. I mean, this is a long-standing issue with all climate finance, that they have to show this additionality, which is very difficult in this kind of context. And I think, you know, separating between development and adaptation is hard enough. And now we're moving into terrain of loss and damage. You know, is this loss and damage? Is it adaptation? But I think a couple of things. I think it's very clear from both what Chris presented and what we hear from people in Amhara that the climate is changing and that there are new patterns emerging that even with you know, that is different from what is experienced before. So the current funding is inadequate to address those challenges. And the attribution science, of course, whether this can be attributed to global climate change is an open question, but attribution science is making progress as well. So I think that also helps in that sort of additionality question here. And I think a key point I was trying to make also was that social protection has an important role, but it can't do it alone, especially the more transformative side of things. It's not set up to do so, first of all, but it also is overstretched already in what it's trying to do at a basic level. So I think there will always have to be a combination of social protection with other types of interventions, whether they be, you know, at a national level or subnational local level. So I think, yeah, and yeah, so others can come in. I can see Johan Belay has his hand up. Thank you.
Yeah, Johan Belay, please come in.
Okay, thank you for giving me the chance. First, I would like to thank my colleagues Lars and Jeremy for your clear presentation. Similarly, last time Jeremy has also nailed the point during our annual basic meeting. Yeah, as Lars presented, PSNP you see, couldn't help the locals to transform their life. They frequently, you see, or repeatedly responded that it helped us not to die or not to recover. This is the main point. But when we take this to the ethic perspective, PSNV couldn't help locals to transform their livelihood, let alone transform. It couldn't help to leniently transform. Rather, it kept most of them in the same stability landscape and some of them in the same basin of attractions. For instance, relying on the same agricultural activities by producing crops based on large animals. And at the same time, or sometimes it helped them to cross thresholds of basic different basins of attractions, but within the same stability landscapes. For instance, they have been helped by the PSNP, that is indirectly to save money, that is PSNP was promoting saving. So they crossed basins of attractions through just relying on small ruminants. So PSNP couldn't help them to create a new stability landscape, a new system. They couldn't transform their livelihood, or they couldn't establish new ways of making a living. Besides, their long-established tradition of moving outside their territory to make a living in the new stability landscape has been constrained by the recurrent inter-ethnic conflicts in the country. You see, this has constrained them not to move to another stability landscapes, to engage in a different livelihood activities. Regarding this, recently an Ethiopian man who is a director of World Health Organization, during his interview said, our resources are enough to transform livelihoods of peoples, but we were and still are investing on war or conflict. As you know, our world is mired with proxy war or direct war that claim thousands of lives and distracted livelihood. This is the case in Ethiopia. So the fund from CNP was more than enough to leniently transform the livelihood of the locals, but war, corruption, and absence of good governance exacerbated the negative impacts of climate change-induced challenges. However, as Anna McCord said, though PSNP couldn't help locals to transform their livelihood, it is still the main element in the same stability landscape that was and still is helping the locals, mainly the vulnerable groups, to cope with the climate change and conflict-induced challenges. So, to your surprise, in the absence of PSNP, do you hear me?
Yeah, can you just wrap up the point, Johan? We're running low on time now.
Okay. The absence of PSNP, the Ethiopians might, in the absence of PSNP, the Ethiopians might have faced famine like the one that they experienced in 1984 and 1985. In this case, the role of PSNP is paramount in saving lives and help locals thrive in the recurrent climate change and conflict-induced challenges. So what shall we do to transform the livelihood of the locals?
Yes.
The Ethiopian government, in collaboration with the World Bank, started, you see, a new program called Big Push that's investing a lot on the locals to transform their livelihoods. You see, however, this has been, you see, this has faced challenge because of the inter-ethnic conflicts in the country, and we are also calling another one from our neighbors. We need to stop war in order to transform the livelihood of them. Thank you so much.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I'm just conscious of the time, and we do want the chance for others as well to come in with more questions. But thank you. Some very strong points, well made, and we might come back to this in a final round of reflections. Megan, I don't want us to lose the chance to revisit the poll. So could we come back to you now, and then we can maybe do one last round of the panel responding to any questions that might come up from this.
Yes, we can be very brief. I think you can all still see my screen. So the top one was related to funding opportunities, specifically pushing that we want multi-year funding with and developing relationships with donors, demonstrating impact. This is sort of everything in a nutshell, really, but they're really addressing sort of they're trying to address this sort of short-term projectized approach that we know so many programs are struggle with. Marta, we can move to the next one. Number 2, the rant was we waste absolutely tons of money working inefficiently. We could give that to local people. I think probably a lot of us feel that way very strongly sometimes. So we need to improve evaluation systems and integrate participatory approaches and local knowledge. Actually, I think we are seeing, I've seen the top 5 that Marta shared with me, and this concept of evaluation is coming up strongly, evaluation and financing. Next one, please, Marta. So participatory action. This was my adjustment, so I would disclose, but it got voted up, which is lovely. So I was just emphasizing that, yeah, anticipatory action, but there's also, you know, a wide range of uses for forecasts that can improve these systems. Go for the next one. International organizations need to work less in silos. So the suggestion is to pool funding and restructure to area-based approaches. That will be quite a significant adjustment, but it seems like that had some resonance for people. So significant adjustment to the way that the financing works. I mean, loss and damage maybe a bit less so. Anyhow, we could revisit that in the discussion if we like. And then I think there's one more. Reactive funding. Yeah. So we need the adjustment is we need strategic, large-scale, joined-up funding, not reactive and project-based, separated by different agencies and preferences. So I think there's a couple of them that came to the top 5 that are really focusing on this. Need for the support to be systemic and predictable, not just for households, but also the institutions delivering it, and not be projectized, not just to be reactive, and to be planned out, to be joined up, to be sufficiently funded, and so forth. That seems to be really resonating with lots of people. Hand it back over. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating. And we're very happy always to have feedback on the game. So feel free to send a message to us, and we tweak it as we go for these kinds of activities. Over.
And thank you so much, Megan and Martha. I really enjoyed that game. It was my first foray into this, but it was excellent and a lot of fun. So, so thank you for running that. I wanted to just pick up one point from the poll that I think connects back to a point that Anna had made in her presentation, which is, you know, really the need to move away from project-based approaches to something that is more systemic. That, you know, climate changes, you know, and the possible impacts of it are really throwing the gauntlet down upon these sectors in this way, that we need to think much bigger, much more imaginatively and ambitiously than we currently are. But it can be very hard to see that space, to see what it looks like, given that, you know, we see around us what we're already familiar with. So I don't know, Anna, if you know, just to give you the chance to say more, since you were breezing across points, if there's anything you wanted to add around that point. It would also be, you know, interesting to hear from others on the panel what something different from our current sort of project-based, more reactive approaches could look like. But Anna, could we start with you?
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. I mean, I think this is really the issue. We've developed a social protection system based on norms of Europe in the 1940s, effectively. That was where the ideas developed, and then they've been exported around the world, and I think they don't fit anymore. I mean, this period of really profound economic restructuring needs a rethinking of what social protection is, the instruments, the way we provide resources, looking at the division of mandates, looking at the institutional architecture. So I think this really is a key point. And we've seen it historically. If you look back when there have been really major economic disruptions, each time during the Industrial Revolution, you saw the emergence of one kind of social protection. Then last century, we saw the emergence of a new kind. And I think now we need to be asking questions to really rethink what social protection should look like and how we can ensure this right to ensure that people's basic needs are met. We need to think how can we do that, and I think it really does require some difficult blue sky thinking. So yeah, I'd love to hear the thoughts of the other panel members on that, but I think that's the challenge for us as a community just now.
Does anyone else in the panel want to take a bite at that one? It's perhaps the hardest question of all, but arguably the most important one. And I mean, Anna, there's ideas out there that many of us here will be familiar with, such as the social protection floor. Is it things like that that might point us to examples of what social protection beyond might look like?
Well, yeah, it might be that we need to think beyond adaptive social protection, shock responsive social protection, the social protection floor. I mean, the kind of instruments we're using, the way we're targeting people, these are all going to be challenges. If you have these mass impacts over large populations, I mean, is the kind of detailed targeting, poverty-based targeting approach that we use at the moment, is that appropriate when you're trying to deliver to large populations simultaneously? I think there are a whole range of reasons that the existing tools we have may not be appropriate. Are contributory tools, how appropriate are contributory tools if you've got labour market disruption? How viable are going to be insurance-based approaches which use private sector engagement? You have to have a profit there. And if you're seeing the risk pool, the relative size of the risk pool and those effective is changing, that may have implications for how viable private sector investment in insurance-based solutions to social protection provision are. So, and this whole issue of national responsibility for financing social protection, which has been so much an objective of the donor community over recent decades, how viable is that? If we're really looking at equitable burden sharing, we're looking at the impact in many of the poorest countries of climate change. So I think we really have to look beyond the existing models. It's what we have is an excellent basis to start from, but we need to be more radical in how we think about providing large-scale, affordable provision on an equitable basis for a just transition. So I think it's a new set of questions, really, Jeremy, and we need new answers.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to give a chance, of course, to anyone else here to raise questions. Please add to the chat if you'd rather not come on camera, or do raise your hand. We have just a few final minutes here. So there's a chance to hear from different settings. We've heard a lot about Ethiopia. If anyone would like to share from a different context, that could be helpful. And while you are mulling possible questions, I guess sort of something on my mind is, what one thing could social protection actors be doing now to improve the likelihood that programs could contribute to adaptive capacities? So, we've heard that, in places like Ethiopia, they've delivered on the protective function, but they aren't quite delivering, or indeed are quite far away from delivering on something more ambitious beyond that, on adaptive capacities. So that is an aspiration out there. So, especially amongst donors. So what change could be made to programs to make this more likely that these programs support adaptive capacities? Lars Otto, would you like to have a go at that one?
Yes, well, that is the million-dollar question, so to speak. I don't think I have a good answer to what, there is no silver bullet, single silver bullet here, but I think just to pick up a point that also Anna made at the start, I think to sort of avoid the maladaptive outcomes of, I mean, yes, finance and climate finance and more funding is needed, but we also have to make sure that that funding isn't making things worse. And I think we have to find a balance between thinking that climate change is the cause of all ills and not being important at all. And I think the best way we can do that, which I think we are making progress on, or sort of there progress made, is to prepare and build into programming more flexibility, more recognition of uncertainty, more recognition that uncertainty will always be with us, no matter how much how good the climate models are becoming, and our ability to forecast and predict and project climate change. It will always be a large amount of uncertainty left, and the best we can do is to prepare for flexibility. So not tie ourselves to one particular outcome, and not pretend that we can do that also in soil protection programming, but rather help people to have more choices and more livelihood choices, and also leave more to their own judgment, so to speak, not assume that we know what's best course of action for people wherever they are. And I think that goes for soil protection programs, and it goes for all types of interventions that are trying to help people adapt or become resilient, or whatever term we're using here. So that's just a very quick reflection. Thank you.
Yeah. Megan, Chris, would either of you want to come in on that question, or anything else as just a final thought?
I mean, I'd love to just confirm, or agree with what Lars is saying about the flexibility and the uncertainty, and think, again, coming back to the point I was trying to make about simplistic assumptions about the role of climate versus other factors. So I think we can easily jump in the boat that climate is the cause of all ills. I think what we're pushing for is a more nuanced and richer understanding of how these things interact. Yes, and then navigating the uncertainty is the key here. So thanks, yeah, I agree.
Excellent, thank you. And Megan, we've seen your comment as well in the chat. It's been a really interesting discussion. We began with Anna sort of laying down the need to rethink orthodoxies. And then Chris, you went in going through the storylines, you made the point around the need to, not resting on simplified narratives. And Lars Otto stressed the importance of learning how to build resilience from below. And I sort of see all of these as really interconnected points. There's a huge challenge here for the nexus between social protection and climate change, and sort of learning more from below, engaging with local communities and capacities at that level to understand the innovations that in many cases are already happening is, it's not everything, but it's sort of one way forward, and something that we can do through our research capacities and tools. It's an agenda we can be acting on now. And so that leaves me hopeful. Thank you so much for, to the panel, but also to all the participants for listening in this afternoon on Workers' Day. Thank you for enjoying your afternoon with us. It's been a really great discussion. There's many links here in the chat. So I don't know if you will have access to that after the meeting, but please, do get in touch with one of us afterwards. You can find us pretty easily online. We'd be happy to continue the conversation with you. So be well, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.